Hey guys, I've been a little negligent in my book reviewing lately, as you can probably tell. I haven't posted one in about a week and a half or two, and you can obviously see the new background. I'm in my room as opposed to out front, so I thought I'd use what little daylight I have left to make these videos with the aid of a lamp. I have 3 book reviews for you today, and as always I'll put them in different videos, but I'll post them all tonight. We'll see how long the sunlight lasts. And the first one I'd like to do for you is a little sort of history of science and some other stuff. It's called Promethean Ambitions, Alchemy and the Quest to Perfect Nature by William R. Newman. And I figured that living in a time of Dolly the sheep, which it's hard to believe was already 15 years ago or thereabouts, and bioluminescent rabbits. If you don't believe in the bioluminescent rabbits, you can actually go look it up on Google. I swear they exist. It's really easy to lose sight over the ever blurrier distinction between nature and art, which is a pretty popular distinction in philosophy and aesthetics. Art in the sense of anything that's artificial, that is man-made. And most of us are familiar with an example that Newman himself mentions in the book, which is Hawthorne's story The Birthmark, which tells the story of a man who tries to eliminate a small birthmark from the face of his otherwise perfectly beautiful but still extraordinarily beautiful wife's face. The moral of the story is so universal as to be predictable. His effort to perfect the already perfect is to have hubris that can't go unpunished, right? It's to have the arrogance that perhaps only the gods can have. It's to fail to accept in a Newberian sense, which is someone about I'll review a book about him next. Our own limitedness and the limitedness of our own nature, and perhaps the sin, if you want to theologize that concept, of human nature. But one of the goals of Newman's book is to show that this conversation is actually much older than the 19th century. It's actually much, much older, and it goes back at least to the myth of Icarus and Arachne, the Greek myth. I've had a long-standing interest in the history of science. I don't review too many books on it, but this was admittedly a bit of a blind purchase from the University of Chicago Press, which I bought a couple of years ago. The subtitle of the book, which I showed you, Alchemy and the Quest to Perfect Nature, hinted at perhaps a bit of room for the reader of more general interest, not necessarily the scholar looking to read a monograph. But it really was kind of a scholarly book, even more so than a lot of university presses put out. The topic is fascinating in itself, and I walked away from the book feeling that I'd learned a lot about the history of the art-nature debate in its various incarnations throughout history, but it was pretty narrowly technical. The preface offers a nice general introduction to the history of alchemy. And it should be noted that Newman's use of the word alchemy is extremely general. Scientists locked away in a laboratory trying to transmute lead or aluminum into gold should be banished from your mind, because that's not what he's talking about at all here. Instead, think more about any kind of transformation produced by a human being, including the visual arts. So anything that a human being makes, anything that is artificial. And much more into recent history, things like the production of human life through means other than natural means, coitus, like the production of, like the use of in vitro fertilization, or even other methods. In fact, Newman's thesis is that, quote, alchemy provided a uniquely powerful focus for discussing the boundary between art and nature, and that this whole discussion can be understood only if the reader is willing to engage with the presuppositions of pre-modern philosophers, theologians, alchemists, and artists about the structure of nature of the world around them. And when he says that, he's really not kidding when he's talking about the theologians, the philosophers, etc. The heart of the book, as I said, is a truly exhaustive attempt to chart the history of this idea, many of whose contributors will not be recognizable, even to readers who enjoy, delving into the occasional history of science book. Some are more popular. There's the Arabic philosopher Ibn Khaldun, Avicenna, Averroes, Thomas Aquinas. They all play gigantic roles, and they're probably more familiar, but most are unfamiliar. Some of the people discussed that I'd never heard of include Jean de Meun, Petrus Bonus, Thomas Erastus, Bernard Palissy, and Zosimus of Panopolis. And if you've heard of any of those people, you're just much smarter than I am. And there are dozens of people discussed in a relatively short book, and it's kind of tough to keep them all straight, as I'll talk about. There are so many of them, in fact, whose ideas loom large in a small book that they're often picked up, left behind, and only to be picked up in another chapter, leaving you to sort of flip back and forth in order to intellectually reorient yourself and follow the thread of the argument. I'll spare you the various transmutations and permutations of all of the alchemy and the complex arguments, and they do get very complex. But Newman seems to have two important takeaways here. And one is that our view of alchemy as synonymous with witchcraft or other black arts is pretty naive and historically undeveloped, and that it needs to be expanded to include, as I said, all of the arts, in the sense of anything that's artificial, like I said earlier. The second and more important one is that this intellectual conversation has a long, subtle, storied past in the disciplines of philosophy, theology, and the natural sciences. And this should, without a doubt, be read by someone who has a more narrow, serious interest in this subspecialty. In this case, if that is the case, you're probably already familiar with his name, since he's one of the better-known scholars in this subfield of the history of science. But the book doesn't even have a bit of the more, not necessarily mass appeal, but slightly more mass appeal to a more popular audience that it might have had. That might have made it a little bit more enjoyable, at least for this non-specialist. And the mass appeal that the subtitle sort of led you to believe that it might have had. But interesting nonetheless. Definitely read it if you're interested. Promethean Ambitions, Alchemy and the Quest to Perfect Nature by William R. Newman.